Hello and welcome back to another video. This one is going to be about my Intrepid 4x5 as it has been just over 6 months since I bought this camera. And in those 6 months I have used it many times and I've gotten quite comfortable with using this camera, so I thought I'd share my thoughts about it. I was going to make this a pros and cons video, but it would be quite short as like the pros aren't really pros and the cons aren't really cons. They're just things I could say about the camera, so instead of doing that I'm just going to share my thoughts. It isn't like my other film cameras or my other digital cameras where I can talk about some features that that camera has that others don't, or some high-tech specs or whatever. It really is just a box that has a hole in it for a lens. So like I said before, instead of doing a pros and cons video, I'm just going to share my thoughts about this camera after owning it for 6 months. And sort of just 4x5 as a whole, some of these points aren't specific to the Intrepid, but also some of them are. Anyway, let's just get into it. I bought this camera because I had previously shot on 4x5 and 8x10 a few times before and I absolutely loved it. But once I started watching some Brian Burke's videos, I just knew I had to get one. I fell in love straight away. Over these 6 months, I think I've shot entirely portraits apart from 2 different photos. So in this video, you shouldn't expect me to talk about how amazing it is to stop down the lens and get no diffraction at higher apertures. I primarily shot this thing wide open. I say wide open, but I primarily shot between f5.6 and f11, and that may not seem like that wide, but it really is on a large format camera, specifically 4x5. On 4x5, a 5.6 lens is the equivalent of a 1.5 lens on a 35mm camera system, and an f11 lens is the equivalent of a 2.97 lens. And that is because on a 4x5 there is a crop factor of 0.27 times, so any lens you're going to get, you're going to have to times the focal length and the aperture by 0.27, so 150 would be like 46 or something, I'm not entirely sure, and then 5.6 would be 1.51, so yeah, basically 1.5. Anyway, I'll get away from the technical stuff and just talk about my experience with the camera. And I have to say, using a 4x5 camera for portraits is an amazing experience. The quality of the ridiculously large 4 inches by 5 inches negative is just mind-blowing. I don't even scan my photos at that high quality because I don't want to wait 15 to 20 minutes per photo, but even then, I don't need to. The quality that I get from a couple minute scan is more than I could ever use or need. Unless you're printing your image to the size of a building, you would never need this much quality, it's just ridiculous. Also, camera movements were something that I was very excited about when I got this camera. If you don't know, on large format cameras, you can move the lens in multiple different directions. You can also do this with tilt shift lenses on like 35mm systems, and also some medium format systems that are very unique. This can help you change perspective of your image while keeping your camera in the exact same place as it was before, but it can also change your focus plane, which can get you some very funky looking images. I like to keep my movements to a minimum, as with large format I think less is more. You can very easily go overboard and have images that in my opinion look ridiculous. So I keep my movements down to a couple millimeters whenever I do them. When I use movements on my 4x5 camera, I pretty much only ever use tilt. I've used shift a few times, but I could just never get it right. Anyway, using tilt is a great way to pretty much fake your depth of field. Like I mentioned before, f5.6 on a 4x5 camera is the equivalent of f1.5, and like I said, I like to shoot wide open whenever I can, and it's quite difficult to focus when doing that since on a 4x5 camera you have to focus wide open, like you can't do it any other way because otherwise your image may not be in focus. So what I do to keep that shallow depth of field look is to add a little bit of tilt so then the focus plane changes, which makes it look like I've shot it at a wider aperture, when in reality I shot it at like f11 to f16. Just a quick note before people get mad at me, yes I do still focus at f5.6 when doing this, I just then stop down the lens a little bit. I had someone comment on one of my learning large format videos when I mentioned that I do this, and they basically just said that I was completely wrong and it didn't change anything whatsoever. And all I can say to that is they are wrong, and I know of a few other photographers that also use this technique. And I also recommend people to try this technique, as before I was doing it, I was struggling to get images that I liked, but this really helped to exaggerate that shallow depth of field without actually keeping the lens open at f5.6, because that's just incredibly difficult to nail focus. There are some limitations to doing this method. For example, if you do a full body portrait and you tilt the lens, the feet are most likely going to be out of focus, but I like to keep it for like half body shots because then it looks a lot more natural, because then it just sort of just like faces in focus, and then down here it just gradually falls off, so it looks quite nice. But with full body portraits it can be a disaster. I just want to quickly touch on one disadvantage I've had while using this Intrepid 4x5. While using this camera is amazing and I have lots of fun, for the person that I'm photographing it can be quite tedious. This is because setting up this camera for use takes quite a long time. Even between focusing and shooting, it takes a while. You have to focus, change the settings on your lens, put your film holder in, take the dark slide out, and then you're able to take the photo. And this isn't really a problem when shooting landscapes, but when taking portraits it can be a bit of a challenge as the person has to stay still that whole entire time. But in my opinion, the challenge adds to the charm and it makes you just so much more grateful for that photo if it turns out good. Since we just spoke about something negative, I may as well add this one in as well. The build quality of the Intrepid isn't the best. I knew this before I bought it, as I had spoken to some YouTubers who use the Intrepid or have used it in the past, and basically they all said that it was good for the price, but the build quality is a bit disappointing. Personally, I haven't had any issues with my Intrepid, but I can tell that it was quite a cheap camera to make. The whole camera just feels a bit cheap, and the fact that it is 3D printed definitely has something to do with that, but also I think it's because of how the camera is put together and also how it functions. For example, when I got this camera out of the box, I noticed that a few screws were a little bit loose, so I had to tighten them myself. It's not a big issue, but you'd expect the people to make the camera would tighten the screws. Also, I just want to add that the part that my lens is attached to isn't actually level to the rest of the camera. It's only off by like a few millimeters, but when you're looking straight on from the camera, there's the bit where you're actually like looking through the ground glass, which is level, and then the bit that my lens is attached to is just like that, and it just looks a bit weird. It doesn't cause any issues, but still, quality control isn't the best. Also, another issue that I have with the Intrepid is how there isn't a locking feature or like a zeroing feature for when you're initially setting up the camera. It has it on the tilt movement, which is very useful, but it's not on any of the other movements, and especially not when you're setting up the camera, which is a very vital part of a 4x5 system, is to have everything level. I can't imagine it would cost that much more to add this feature into the next generation of Intrepid cameras, but it would just improve them so much more. Every other large format camera I've used has some sort of zeroing out feature to help you get everything straight and everything aligned. But all the Intrepid has is a few spirit levels which aren't even very helpful, as you could be on an uneven surface, and yeah, it's just really inaccurate. But you know, you do get used to it, so it isn't that big of a problem. But it would be such a nice feature, something that would just improve the camera system so much, is just adding a zeroing feature rather than a spirit level. Anyway, let's just get away from the negative stuff and get back to the good stuff. While I mentioned this camera can be a bit of a pain to take portraits of people, it does make up for it 100% by giving you an advantage to photograph people that other cameras just don't have. For example, if you ask to take a portrait of someone with like a 35mm camera style thing, like a full frame, 35mm crop sensor, whatever, then they're probably going to think you're quite weird. But if you ask to take someone's portrait with a medium format camera, a lot of them will be more intrigued, but they still might say no. But if you ask to take someone's portrait with a 4x5 camera, they are most likely going to say yes, as it is a very unusual and intriguing thing. Whenever I've mentioned using my 4x5 camera to get a portrait of someone, they have immediately said yes. It gives you a major advantage of getting portraits of people that other cameras don't give you, and I think that's one of my favourite things with it. And that's purely because it's not very common and it's quite intriguing. Obviously there will be the occasional person that says no because they're probably very grumpy or they just don't want their photo taken. But I think for the vast majority of people, they are more intrigued and more likely to say yes. I'm pretty sure Negative Feedback also mentioned something about this in an old video. I think it's something along the lines of he wanted to take a portrait of a dad and his newborn baby that were just out and about, and he said that he wouldn't be able to do it if it wasn't for the 8x10 camera. Another great thing about this Intrepid 4x5 is just how light it is. A lot of 4x5 cameras can be quite heavy and they're a bit difficult to carry around, and you may be put off completely by having to carry around a big heavy wooden box. But since the Intrepid system is made of 3D printed plastic, or some lightweight wood and some aluminium, then it means that it weighs full. In fact, my GFX is heavier than the Intrepid 4x5 and the lens. and it only gets to a similar weight once I add my tripod into the mix as well. And that's another benefit of having a lightweight camera. You don't have to carry around a big heavy tripod to use it. I've just got a cheap tripod that cost me like £40 from Amazon, and it can hold my 4x5 with ease, even at an angle where the camera is slanted a lot. I would eventually like to upgrade my tripod to a geared one, as the one that I have right now is a ball head one, and that's not the best for 4x5 work. I feel like this video has gone on for ages, so I'm just going to finish it up with giving my thoughts on whether the camera is worth it or not. And in my opinion, yes, it is worth it. It allows you to get into large format photography without having to pay a ridiculous amount of money. The large format world is expensive, but by using an Intrepid, it means you're getting a camera that has very similar features to a higher end camera, and you're paying a fraction of the price. And all you're really sacrificing is the build quality and a few features here and there. But sacrificing the build quality doesn't mean the camera's going to fall apart on you at any moment, it just means it's going to feel a little bit cheaper. In total, I got my 4x5 setup, which includes my 4x5 camera body, my lens, 2 film holders, a tripod, 2 boxes of film, shutter release cable, loop, and I think that's it for just under £800. And while that is still a lot of money, in the large format world, that can barely get you a camera body. And that's why I think the Intrepid 4x5 system is worth it. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.